for people to be admitted through the waiting room. We'll give it just a second here, and then we'll get started. I would ask that you mute yourself if you're not participating or talking today. There's a little bit of background noise. Thank you. Well, I will go ahead and get started. I wanted to welcome everyone and say good afternoon and let you know that we're delighted you're here, especially if this is your first IAC webinar. My name is Angie Price, and I'm the Quality Improvement Director for our site network. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. You can get a copy of the recording on our site network portal. We will have links to the portal posted in the chat, as well as provide the link at the end. So speaking of the chat, we encourage you to post questions, make comments. We really want this to be interactive. We want to learn from you, and it really helps make the webinar more meaningful and more content. So it's really nice. At the end, we hope to have time to address those questions. So for those of you who don't know, IACT is an independent, non-for-profit organization. We work with patients, sites, and pharmaceutical companies to expedite therapeutic interventions for children. We support a network of over 70 trial-ready sites by providing clinical opportunities, mentoring, educational webinars, and grants. We also work with pharmaceutical companies on pediatric clinical trial design, feasibility, and site identification projects, and as well as engaging in important initiatives designed to advance pediatric research. So that's a little bit about us, and now on to today's webinar, why pediatric trials need to grow up. Or better yet, why haven't they grown up yet? Today's webinar is about pediatric trials, why they haven't progressed as much as we think they should have since 1960, when children were recognized as therapeutic and pharmaceutical orphans. Surprisingly, despite all the efforts made over the past decade regarding legislation and federal incentives, there continues to be a lag in pediatric drug approval timelines, the need to write off-label prescriptions, and limited resources to conduct these trials. In addition, a large percentage of these trials fail to meet enrollment goals, fail to get started, or even publish their results. Today, we will be discussing the various reasons for these challenges and what can be done to help these trials finally grow up. So we recognize that this is not easy and there is no one solution. It will take everyone across the pediatric research ecosystem to bring meaningful changes. Our goal today is to provide a little more information about the history of pediatric research development and the steps we can all take to improve the process. But it begins with why it all matters. And today, what matters is the patient. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce you to Ashley Aiken, an amazing young lady I had the privilege of taking care of when she was little. Ashley is one of approximately 30,000 Americans living with cystic fibrosis. As a young girl, Ashley participated in one of the first phase 1 CF trials for ivacaftor. This drug was aimed at treating CF. Before this drug, there were only medications used to treat signs and symptoms of the disease. Today, Ashley is living a life not previously thought possible. She's graduated from the University of Central Florida with a degree in event management and now works for the UCF College of Nursing organizing their events. Ashley's here today to tell her story and to highlight the sense of urgency we all should feel around pediatric drug development. Hey, Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much, Angie. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much. So my name is Ashley. I'm 26 years old and I was born with cystic fibrosis. I was diagnosed at 9 months old. I was a relatively healthy kid. I had some complications in the beginning that were pretty scary, and then was relatively healthy and participated in a few, as Angie mentioned, pediatric trials. And then as I grew up, you know, infections take over and I was in and out of the hospital while I was in school, in and out of the hospital while I was in college. Things got pretty scary there at times, but about 3 years ago, I was put on a medicine, Trikafta, that was put through research trials, and I was put on after it went to market, and that has saved my life. It's completely changed my life. I haven't been in the hospital since. I've been living a normal life. I have a career. I graduated, like Angie mentioned, and I'm living a relatively normal life, which is so exciting. And that's such a testament to how excuse me, important research is and important research trials are. Um, so like I said, I participated in a couple pediatric trials back when I was younger, about 10, 12, a little older, kind of that range. So being in those trials can sometimes be a little scary because you don't really know what you're doing when you're that young. And by that time, when you have cystic fibrosis, you're used to needles, you're used to tests, you're used to doctors, but still going in the morning and taking all these needles and this, it's sometimes like, oh my goodness, what did I sign up for? But I think even at that young age, it was so clear to me how big of an impact this is going to make and where we're headed. And I know that sounds crazy, at 10 years old, thinking about the future of cystic fibrosis or medicine, but it is true. They did a good job of talking about the importance and what you're doing and where we're going. And now, about 10, 12, 14 years later, we're seeing those results. And like I said, I got on that medicine, and other people I know with CF are on these medicines, and the lung function is going up, the hospital stays are going down, people are living the lives we never thought would happen. I'm 26 years old. There were times I didn't know if I would make it to 25, 26. So the fact that not only am I here and I feel like I'm thriving is just, it's so exciting. And I love talking about the disease and where we're going. There's so much hope, and I think that's what research and trials and whatnot do for someone with the disease. And my family is, we're always talking about what's in the pipeline and what are the research trials going on, and we're reading the articles. And there was even something during the Notre Dame game on Saturday. There was a whole special on some research that's going on in the CF world. So just, I have goosebumps right now, and that's the exciting part, is talking about the hope that these trials instill. But there is always a sense of urgency. Cystic fibrosis is a progressive disease. So when things go bad, they keep getting bad. And how can we stop that? And I'm one of the very lucky ones. My family's very lucky that I'm doing really well as a result of a certain drug. But there are plenty of families that were not as lucky, and they've lost their loved ones. As hard as they fought, the medicine didn't come in time, and that can be really hard to see as someone with a progressive disease. Of that could have been me, that could have been my mom, that could have been my dad, who said if they only had a couple more years, they would have made it. And there are people that lost the battle to CF, and not even a year later, the medicine came out that could have saved them. So that can be a hard concept to swallow. Of that, it's great that they're in the pipeline, but what if they don't come in time? What if I get sick before I can access that medicine? And I think that is the sense of urgency for research trials, and to get the medicine out there, and for people to benefit from these amazing findings. And it can be hard to see that sometimes, people don't get to benefit from them because of just timing. But I'm very thankful for the position I'm in. I'm very thankful for the doctors and nurses and the trialists and everyone that is involved with my disease, with many other diseases in the world. And they're definitely making a difference. And I'm so excited to see where it goes. There's a lot of hope in the world because of everyone involved, and I'm very thankful.
Thank you, Ashley. I really appreciate you joining us today. I think a lot of times researchers get in the day-to-day and kind of forget why we're all doing this. And that's why I felt like it was so important to have you come on and share your story. And it really is a story of hope. But it is also a reminder that not everybody has had access to cutting-edge research, either because it's taken too long, as I think you even said 10 to 12 years. I mean, that's your perception as a patient. It took 10 to 12 years for this drug to come to market. So, again, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. And you're my favorite patient, just so everybody knows. I'm telling the world. So I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce AJ Allen, our newly appointed Chief Medical Officer. AJ is a child adolescent psychiatrist and pharmacologist. AJ retired, sort of, in 2021 from Eli Lilly, where he was committed to developing policies, programs, and infrastructure to improve pediatric drug development. He's been active in trial bioethics and is a former member of the HHS Secretary Advisory Committee on Human Research Protection. Although AJ's retired, he continues to advocate for pediatric development as well as mentoring and consulting. AJ has also played a crucial role in the creation of IACT. It only seems fitting that he's come home to be our CMO. Welcome, AJ. We're delighted to have you here today to talk about why pediatric research needs to grow up.
AJ, you're on mute.
Got it. I want to just thank Ashley for her comments. That was, to me, a very important reminder of the pediatric gap, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, and why we need to continue to work to accelerate pediatric drug development. Can I have the next slide? So this is just a teaser polling question for you. The poll isn't active, so you don't have to do anything. Just take a look at these, and as we go through, try and pick out where I'm talking about some of these topics and what you think the answer is at the end of the day. So next slide. What we're going to focus on initially is pediatric drug development versus adult drug development. And I'm going to tell you up front, I don't talk just in terms of pediatric clinical trials, because today, one of the things that's changed is we have to deal not just with clinical trials, but with a whole range of different activities in pediatric drug development that often spans the period between trials or takes data from adult studies and uses those to predict things that we need to know for the pediatric studies. So today we're really talking about drug development overall. Pediatric trials are part of that, adult trials are part of that as well. Next slide. So the fundamental thing to remember about drug development is that what's required at the end of the day is pretty simple. It really consists of, depending how you look at it, for maybe three different things. First of all, you need data that shows the potential benefits of the drug or the biologic for the patients with the indication you're trying to study. And you also need data that shows what the risks are and safety concerns. And ultimately, those are combined to look at whether the drug does more good than it does harm. Is the benefit-risk ratio positive? If it's not positive, we're done, and we don't need to worry about things. But if it is positive, then we have a drug that potentially can be useful. And in addition to having that data about the benefit-risk balance, you need to have information on how to use the drug in a way that achieves that balance, including information on the dosing, how often does the drug have to be given, what the concentration is, et cetera, or the tablet size or whatever, as well as the formulation. We need to have formulations that are appropriate for the patient population that we're dealing with. And then finally, we need to have information on how do you evaluate the course of therapy and watch for safety problems that might occur. Do you need to monitor tests, for example, blood pressure, to look for hypertension? Do you need to look for liver function tests in order to watch out for potential drug-induced liver injury or things like that? How you get this data, whether it's for adults or pediatrics or any other subpopulation that we're talking about, really may be the same way for all those populations, or it may be different. You may do trials in one population, you may be able to extrapolate another. We'll come to extrapolation in a moment. What's important is that the means that you use to generate that data need to be scientifically valid. They need to generate high quality data, and they need to be acceptable to FDA or the regulators that you're working with. And this is true not just in the US, but around the world. So it's important. These really are the fundamental things that have to be considered. Next slide. So when it comes to FDA, the regulations require that FDA only approve indications based on data. They can't, just make things up or take a sponsor's word for something. They have to actually look at the data and evaluate that. Most of the sponsors focus on developing data for chronic conditions that primarily occur in adults. And the reason they do this is, sponsors, industry is a business. They have to answer to shareholders. They have to look at how can they maximize the benefits to their bottom line based on the resources that are required. And as part of this, the way to do that is to focus on long-term conditions that have a lot of patients, and then whatever the price is. And so that's what generates sales. And chronic conditions are typical in adults, and in fact, many of those chronic conditions are also a result of lifestyle issues, concerns about how much people eat, whether they smoke, drink alcohol, things like that. Relatively few pediatric patients fit those conditions. Most pediatric patients, if you think about it, are have different conditions that are related to either genetics or things like birth defects. And it's only a little bit later that we start to potentially get environmental factors that come into play, and often not really ones that pediatric patients have control over. So the conditions you're typically dealing with in pediatric are very different, even though they may also be chronic conditions, from those that you see in adults. And of course, the other big category in pediatric patients that's a concern are things like infectious disease, acute illnesses that may occur in adults, but because they're not particularly long-term infection or long-term condition, they're not as profitable. So focus for most companies, because of all of this, is to early in development, when they're filing their IND, they're focusing development on drugs that have these chronic long-term conditions, and they put the resources to develop the drugs for those adult conditions. And that is, what they discuss in their IND. Pediatrics usually is not really covered there. Next slide. So when does pediatrics come into the IND, or the investigational new drug application? Well, there's a law, and we will come to that in a moment, that requires that sponsors submit an initial pediatric study plan, which is treated as an addendum to the IND, no later than 60 days after the end of phase 2 meeting, or it may be earlier if they want. That's their choice. And if there's no end of phase 2 meeting, it's specified as being 210 days before the NDA or BLA submission. So to give you a sense of how much time this is, we're talking about the IND for the adult development being submitted prior to phase 1, and the requirement for pediatric submission of an IPSP typically being submitted at the end of phase 2. So we've got phase 1 and phase 2 that are intervening there. That usually is somewhere between 3 to 5 years of time. So we're starting with a deficit of 3 to 5 years in pediatric development relative to adults. Next slide. And why is this? Well, there's two basic laws that are applicable to pediatric drug development. There's actually a lot of laws, but these are the two big ones that we usually talk about. The first is the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act. This creates an incentive of 6 months of patent exclusivity if a company studies drugs or biologics for pediatric patients under an FDA written request. The second one is PREA, or the Pediatric Research Equity Act, and this requires studying drugs and biologics for pediatric patients and this can be including via extrapolation, if the condition that occurs in the adult or the adult indication also occurs in the pediatric population. So important difference between BPCA and PREA is has to be the same indication as the adult indication, whereas BPCA can be any indication potentially, not necessarily the same as the adult indication. The other thing that's worth remembering here is BPCA, we're dealing with an incentive, so that's really an option for industry. We're trying to encourage them to incentivize them to do pediatric studies, whereas with PREA, there's a requirement. These have to be done under the PREA legislation. Next slide. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of BPCA and PREA. I'm not going to go into the details of pediatric study plans and that. For those of you that are interested, I've provided 3 FDA guidance documents that address these topics. These slides are hot linked, so if you have a copy, you can actually connect that way. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier the pediatric gap, and that's really when Ashley was talking, she was talking about the pediatric gap. You know, what's the period of time between when a drug starts to be developed and we have data on pediatrics, and in particular, when we're talking about drugs that are being developed for adult indications, what's the difference between when we first have labeling, we first have an approval for the indication in adults versus when do we have the first approval in the pediatric population. And in the beginning of the 20-teens, there was an average of approximately 10 years between the first adult approval and the first pediatric approval. As I think you may have seen on one of the earlier slides, since then, the numbers have improved somewhat, and it depends really on the interval that you look at because of the fluctuation with different diseases and therapeutic agents. It can range anywhere from about 5 to 10 years now. But overall, we've made a little bit of progress, but it's not a lot. Typically, we're still talking around 10 years, 9 years for the pediatric gap. What does that mean? Well, we'll come to that in a moment, but one way I think of it is that's 10 years that the drug, we don't have any information to guide clinicians about how to use the drug to help pediatric patients. And so if they use it, there's an increased risk, and this is a public health concern that we have to deal with. So what's the single most important reason for this gap? Well, in my mind, it's what we were just talking about. The IND for pediatric or for adult patients, the IND for adult development occurs at the beginning of phase 1, and the IND for pediatric development, the IPSP submission, is not until the end of phase 2 at the latest. Now, it could be earlier. Some companies do go in for certain indications earlier, but many companies wait until the last minute to do the IPSP. So we're talking about a 3 to 5 year gap there, which it's very difficult to catch up on, especially since during that 3 to 5 years, there's often very little going on in terms of planning around pediatric development, because that's not something that's important to the teams. They're focused on getting the adult development done and getting the drug to market for adults. Next slide. So I mentioned what's the consequences of this pediatric gap for patients? Well, it means the pediatric patients wait longer than adults, sometimes much longer, to have new treatments approved by the FDA for them, and also for other regulators to approve these treatments for them. And that's if the treatments are ever approved for pediatric patients. Remember, you have to have data for the FDA that shows a favorable benefit risk balance to have the drug approved for the pediatric population. And sometimes we don't get that data. In my area of specialization, child psychiatry, there are many, many antidepressants that have been tested in pediatrics. They've worked fine in adults, but they don't seem to be working in the pediatric population. And so we've got relatively few treatments for depression in the pediatric population as a consequence of that are approved by the FDA. What does this mean? Well, it means the pediatric patients have fewer options. It also means that in many cases, people use these drugs off-label to treat pediatric patients. And as I like to put it, we often have 5 to 10 years of the Wild West during this pediatric gap period, when people do all sorts of things. And unfortunately, we potentially have a significant risk of adverse events during that time that don't go detected. And that's a concern. So this is an issue not just for pediatric patients and their families. It's a moral and ethical concern, and it's a public health concern as well. So we all need to pay attention to it and try and improve on this. Next slide. And to reinforce that point, I talked with Lynn Yao recently, and I asked her, what were some things that she wanted to emphasize in this talk from the perspective of the FDA. And one of them was related to this pediatric gap and the need for earlier discussions with FDA and earlier development efforts in pediatrics. And so her comment is sponsors need to begin planning for pediatrics earlier, including engage with FDA earlier about pediatric plans. And to give you more detail on this, I've provided a link to one of the recently released FDA draft guidances that deals with pediatric drug development. These came out in May of this year, so just a couple months back. And they include a discussion of kind of how to prioritize this, because it's not necessarily all drugs that we need to speed things up. Sometimes there's a number of treatments available for pediatric patients for a disease, and they work pretty well. In that case, we can maybe wait a little longer. But in other cases, when we have drugs that are new, for new diseases, for example, with COVID, there's a need really to move quickly so that we have available treatments to help with those conditions. And there's lots of rare diseases that don't have any treatment at all. And so those are also ones where we really need to try and accelerate development. So that's discussed in this FDA guidance. Next slide. Okay, so as somebody that worked in industry and somebody that now works with industry on pediatric development, although I'm no longer in industry and I'm trying to work on behalf of patients and focus on their needs, that's one of the big headaches, this gap in time between pediatric or adult and pediatric approvals and the delays in having conversations with the agency starting on these plans. But what are some other headaches that we deal with in pediatric drug development? Next slide. So, and all of these are things that come into play after sponsors choose to start thinking about pediatric development. So again, this is one of the reasons why I think that's probably the main issue in terms of drug development for kids overall. But we have to remember pediatrics is probably the most heavily regulated area of drug development, much more heavily regulated than the adult drug development programs are. We have multiple laws that deal with pediatrics. We have BPCA, PREA. We've got Subpart D, which deals with the ethics of human research protections, additional research protections for pediatrics. We have the Orphan Drug Act because of rare diseases. We have a variety of state laws and regulations that apply to pediatrics, that apply to schools, that apply to the research setting, as well as other type factors. And then we have, because pediatric programs are almost always developed from a global perspective, we have a number of international guidances and laws that we have to deal with. So it's really a significant challenge to consider all of these things in the pediatric development plans, something that you don't have to do in the adult world, and it makes things much more complex. There's also, as we've mentioned, limited economic incentives that makes it difficult to get sponsors interested in this topic. There are many indications in pediatrics that are rare diseases, And there are many indications that are more common in adults that are rare in pediatric patients. So this makes recruitment difficult just by virtue of the limited number of patients available. We also have to remember that in pediatrics, and this is a difference clinically as well as in the research setting, you're not just dealing with the patient. You must also deal with the parents, the guardians. Sometimes you have to deal with teachers in schools, grandparents, babysitters, and siblings. You know, what parents often will bring the siblings to clinic. How are they going to, you know, what are you going to have for them to do while their brother or sister is seeing the doctor and getting testing, etc. So all of those are important considerations. And we also have to remember there's different standards of care that may occur in the adult versus the pediatric setting. So for example, in oncology, I was in a discussion with some IRBs at one point where one of the pediatric oncologists said, you know, in hematologic cancers, we often use bone marrow transplants. The adult doctors don't necessarily do that as much. And so it makes it a real challenge when we're talking about trying to do a protocol that spans not just adults, but also the pediatric population for a new drug. So next question, or next slide. So this is some additional challenges. You can see there's lots of things that we have to deal with in pediatrics that may be different from adults. You have the question of age-appropriate formulations. Capsules that adults would have no trouble swallowing may be very difficult for a 5 or 6-year-old child to swallow. And there's, of course, even more issues when you start getting into populations like neonates, not only around the size of the capsules in that, but formulation, the excipients that are included in the formulation have to have be evaluated for toxicology, not just in adults, now in this much younger population where the drug metabolizing enzymes may be significantly different. You've got a wide developmental range to cover in pediatrics over a relatively short period of time. Just think of the physical differences between a neonate and an adolescent that's under 18 years of age. Now think of the differences that you see between a young adult and older adults. There's a lot of development that occurs that's different in the population, in the pediatric population. And one of the other things we have to remember is not everything develops at the same rates. Different organs and different systems may mature at different rates. So while, for example, the kidneys maybe function much like adult kidneys from early on, and they're doing the same basic function of clearing waste from the blood. You've got the brain, for example, where there continue to be significant changes in development, even into young adulthood. And so we have to remember that these sorts of things are going on, and it's not just one simple progression. Another thing that we have to deal with in pediatrics is the age of majority. And this is something that I like to think of as an imperfect legal end of the biologic process of development, which is a continuous process. But we set this date, and of course, it's not the same in every jurisdiction. That when does somebody legally go from being a minor to being an adult? And that can make things challenging, even within the United States, where there's some variation in the age of majority between different states. We have increasing push to use decentralized research settings in clinical trials. This can cause problems if those decentralized resources used for those decentralized studies are not pediatric friendly or don't have a pediatric friendly component, like a phlebotomist that's used to doing blood draws in 5-year-olds if your study involves 5-year-olds. So that's another concern. The science of pediatric drug development has also been evolving, and I'm not going to go into what some of the changes are, but I will note just some of the things that contribute to that. We have multiple guidances and draft guidance documents for pediatric drug development now, not just from the FDA, which 10 years or a little over 20 years ago, before 2000, we had two guidance documents on pediatric drug development. One from the FDA that said how do sponsors benefit from BPCA, because that was the one piece of legislation out there, and one from the ICH, International Commission on Harmonization, which was the E11 guidance that gave the basics of doing pediatric development. Just two guidances. Now we have more than a dozen FDA guidances that deal with pediatric drug development overall. And in addition, we've got many of the guidances for specific illnesses that have pediatric sections in them that also address that. And we have additional ICH guidances, including a very important one related to pediatric extrapolation, as well as guidances from the Europeans and other regions as well. So much more information out there to assimilate. We have over 1,000 pediatric labeling changes in the US. And that doesn't include drugs where we may have had studies done, but there wasn't a change in the labeling as a result of those studies. FDA has had access to all of these and is learning from all of these, and academia and industry and others also can and should learn from those. So there's big changes in this, and you can't just copy a pediatric plan from 8 years ago and assume that it's going to be acceptable. And then finally, one of the major changes that I think people don't really appreciate enough is pediatric extrapolation. Next slide. So when we think about pediatric extrapolation, I like to go back to the old saying that people would say, pediatric patients are not just small adults. And my response to that question over time has evolved to be, okay, so what are they? Are they space aliens? This is something that we have to start somewhere. Are they more like adults? Can we learn things from what's been learned in adults that can then be applied to the pediatric population and built on? Or are they totally different? And we have to start from scratch with every pediatric indication with every new drug. I would, just thinking about it, adolescents and adults, if there's a disease that's present in those two populations, probably there's a lot we can learn from adults, especially from the situation with young adults. Remember, a pediatric patient only has to have their 18th birthday to become an adult patient. So that's, their differences there may not be that great. In contrast, when you have neonates, neonates probably are closer to space aliens. There, what we can learn from adults is more limited, but we can still, with modern advances in pharmacometrics and such, we can still learn some things related to the metabolism of the drug, how the dosing needs to be adjusted in those populations, and so on. And then we've got everything in between that, those two extremes. Really, this pediatric extrapolation concept, I don't want to understate how important it is. And to give you an example, without pediatric extrapolation, we would not have had any of our COVID treatments and vaccines as quickly as we did. Now, I'm not saying we had them as fast as we needed them, but we would have been waiting even longer in the pediatric world if not for pediatric extrapolation. It's that important a principle, and we've learned that over time. Next slide. And to reinforce that, again, something that Lynn Yao and I talked about, and her message is today in 2023, pediatric extrapolation needs to be part of the discussion of every pediatric drug development plan. And this is particularly when we start talking about PREA, where we're talking about the same indication in adults and in the children. So this is a really important concept. I cannot do it justice in this presentation, but I've referenced here the ICH E11, the FDA's version of the ICH E11A pediatric extrapolation guidance, which gives a lot of details about this, and although it's still in draft form, is still a very well advanced and really educational tool. I encourage anyone that's not familiar with this concept to take a look at this. Next slide. In addition, I think it's worth noting that it's not just pediatrics that's evolving. Everything else is evolving too. We made some mention earlier of decentralized trials. Another area where things are changing is in terms of the bioethics and the human research protections regulations. As many of you may know, in 2017, the Common Rule was updated, and one of the changes was to encourage the use of single IRBs. This has been picked up by the NIH and their policy, and now the FDA, as of last year, submitted or published a notice of proposed rulemaking, an NPRM, that proposed harmonizing a number of things with the Common Rule, and in particular, one of those was single IRBs. And I've provided a link to the Federal Register notice of this here. And I know this is an unpopular topic. You know, there are pros and cons of single IRBs. One of the challenges with single IRBs is that addressing local issues and local concerns communities is more challenging in that setting. But we're being pushed in a direction that just say no is increasingly not going to be an option. So we need to think about ways to do this, and people are thinking about ways of doing this. Next slide. One example of this that I happen to be aware of because I know some of the people that are involved in developing this is the Smart IRB initiative. I'm not going to get into what Smart IRB is, but I know that there's a lot of centers that participate in this, and you know, it seems to be an effort to balance the powers of having a single IRB with the need to address local concerns and local issues that may come into play. And I would actually be interested in learning from people what they think about this at the end of the presentation. Next. So what are some ways to speed pediatric development, drug development overall? Next slide. So for sponsors and CROs, a few suggestions, some of these based on what we've heard. One goes back to what I was saying earlier, start work on peds earlier, consulting with pediatric experts, like the folks on this call, discussing with the FDA and other regulators, and also anticipating things that you're going to need for pediatric trials, like toxicology evaluations and pediatric formulations. Plan pediatric work as if it was your son, daughter, baby, niece, nephew, whoever that was going to be the first patient enrolled. Think about these things. You know, if you wouldn't put your own child in a trial or a pediatric drug development program, why are you expecting somebody else to do that? How can you make it meet their needs and address their concerns? Improve the monitoring. We've heard stories of monitors that go to sites that don't even know the protocol, that aren't familiar with the methodology, and on and on. This is critical. I can tell you as a former medical director in charge of drug development at Lilly, that we had, you know, that one of the things that's true is if you've got a bad monitor, it's the quickest way to turn off a site to doing a trial. And you need to really, you know, have this, address this. It's probably one of the most critical and underappreciated roles in drug development. Needs to be better communications with everybody. One of the challenges that we heard about is that sponsors sometimes aren't communicating as well as they could with CROs or CROs with sponsors. And this can leave sites feeling very frustrated. And again, the more frustrated sites are, there's other places that they can potentially enroll pediatric patients if you're dealing with more competitive disease states and that. So this is something you've got to keep thinking about. Do a dry run of your protocol to try and find problems before the study starts and fix them at that point, so you don't have to have an amendment later. By the way, also minimize the number of protocol amendments that sites have to deal with. Nothing induces errors quicker than having multiple protocol amendments that sites have to keep track of and get patients or get parents to sign during the course of the study with this as the sponsor or the CRO. And when you contract for the decentralized services for decentralized trials or hybrid trials that include decentralized activities, make sure you have people that are pediatric friendly in those groups, because you only get one shot for the most part at a blood draw in a 5-year-old in somebody's living room. It just is not an option to go have somebody futz around and take 2 or 3 different attempts as you might in an adult. Next slide. For investigators and sites, advocate for your patients and their families. Closing the pediatric gap so your patients can benefit from new treatments and so that you're not frustrated by not having the tools you need to help them. Encourage earlier pediatric work by sponsors and remind them, you have stories, you have the examples of what's happening to your patients. Tell those stories to sponsors and that to help them see the need for what you're doing and the need for earlier work. Plan clinical trials, just like I talked about with the sponsors. You need to think in terms of, what if this was your child that was coming into the trial, or a member of your family? How should they be treated? What would you want your child to experience coming into your clinic for the first visit, say, of a clinical trial? Do a dry run with the protocol to try and get the kinks out. If it turns out that you have to send people between 2 buildings for lab tests, is there a pathway marked? Do you need to send somebody with them to help lead them there? What about parking? Do you have enough parking? When is your clinic open? Everybody that has kids is sensitive about bringing their children in for a doctor's visit or in for repeated research visits when they have to take their kids out of school. So are you available after school? Do you have something on weekends? Those sorts of things. Lots of different things that you can find out by doing these dry runs. Principal investigators, you need to be engaged, you need to be around, you need to be responsive. I can tell you that one of the things that is an issue for sponsors is if it seems like the principal investigator is not around, is not present, is not really being the principal investigator, being in charge of their site. Excuse me. And I should add here that probably one of the most underappreciated and yet critical roles is to have an excellent study coordinator. For those of you that are PIs, they can help you, keep you in line, make sure you do the things you need to do, and they really run the operations for a clinic site. And that's also something that sponsors look for, is good study coordinators. Communicate better with patients and their families. Ask if they want to participate in the trial. One of the misunderstandings is that people don't want to participate in research. A lot of times it's just a matter of you asking about it in order to do that. And then spend enough time on informed consent. It's not just a form, it really is a process, and it should go on throughout the trial, not just at the first visit. And finally, if you have confusion about the protocol, there's problems, call the sponsors or call the CRO if you need. It may be that there's something that you've discovered that nobody else has seen, but it's a significant problem, and that can be important in terms of correcting the protocol or doing some other necessary change to address this. Next slide. Finally, I mentioned talking to kids, getting kids' input, getting families' input. There are lots of ways to do this. You can see the logo here of multiple organizations that have different mechanisms of what people have come to call youth advisory groups. These are all, some of them are more focused on certain disease states, some of them are more general, but this is a way to get information from kids about things that are important in your clinical trial. And I can tell you, as you know, we tried to routinely recommend this with Lily. We've done a lot with it, and it really is a beneficial resource that's important. Next slide. And I'm going to just end by saying I put a slide that has multiple pediatric guidances out there. I did not even try and look for guidances, with the exception of oncology. I didn't even look for guidances where there's a section on pediatrics, but many of the guidances on specific indications have a section on pediatrics in addition. So you can see where how many there are out there. And these are only guidances that apply in the US. I didn't really address anything with Europe or other countries. So you can see just how much our knowledge base has changed in the last few years. And with that, I'm done and happy to take questions.
Thank you, AJ, so much. I think we have a few questions. Holly, have you seen any questions come through? You're on mute.
Thank you, Angie. Just a couple of questions regarding more what the sites can do to help. And I think you touched on that a little bit later in the discussion, but if you have any other comments about what sites can do at their level to help speed the process along.
Yeah, and I think probably it helps to maybe try and categorize what sites can do. You know, there are things that sites can do that can contribute to the overall protocol and the overall study process, working with the sponsor or the CRO. And then there are things that the sites can do at their individual site. You know, they're specific to your site. You know, things like, do we have enough parking, for example? What are our hours of operation? Do we have a phlebotomist that's available during our hours of operation that is used to working with pediatric patients? You know, it doesn't do any good if your clinic's open in the evenings and on weekends, but the only phlebotomist available is somebody that's used to dealing with geriatric patients. You know, those are some of the things. And you know, I think it's one of the reasons I like doing the dry runs. And Lily, in the past, has had a policy of doing these dry runs with protocols, was that it forces you to look at each step of the process along the way. You're not just sort of saying, oh yeah, this piece or that piece, you know, kind of isolated, but it makes you go through and you're actually saying, okay, you know, we're going to have somebody play the role of the mother bringing in their child for this protocol, and they're going to have a sibling along with them. What would their experience be like? And actually going through each of the steps, just like you would, and say, oh, you know, we need to have something here. We need to have a set of directions here to help them get to the laboratory. Or, you know, we've got to make sure we've got enough toys in the playroom. You know, we have a playroom, that's great, but we don't have a lot of toys for different ages in that, and we need to have enough so that siblings of different ages can occupy themselves while their brother or sister is back being evaluated. There's a whole series of things like that need to be considered and taken into account. And really the only way to systematically go about it is to walk through that whole process.
So we also have a question, or probably more of a statement, because I've been there, about IRBs. And I think you talked about the one IRB, but you know, there is that challenge of adding intermediate IRBs.
Yeah.
I think someone was just pointing out that really does prolong the process.
Yeah, I mean, the single IRB, so, you know, it's worth recognizing that there are legitimate reasons for single IRBs. And the concern there is that, you know, when you have, say, 10 sites and 10 IRBs, you also have 10 different consents in many instances. You may have 10, you know, may have half the sites have some special requirement and half the sites don't. In extreme cases, you know, there may be questions, well, this IRB approved the protocol and this one didn't. You know, how do we resolve that type of thing? But there's also legitimate concerns in terms of you know, forcing the requirements. I mean, the IRB requirements include consideration of local factors that come into play, local communities that may be present and things like that. And that's often challenging for single IRBs to deal with. So yeah, no, I get it. You know, I think the thing we have to remember ultimately, and this is something not necessarily so much that I think you folks need to remember, but I do think we need to remind sponsors of the fact, you know, the research protection regulations, the reason that we have those is not because the federal government was abused at Tuskegee, you know, by the course of Tuskegee. It's because the federal government, you know, funded this study and conducted this study that, you know, denied treatment to African-American patients with syphilis and committed other things, other acts that are ethically unacceptable. And the goal of these research protections, they are human research protections of research subjects for the benefit, you know, to help make sure that we don't have, in this case, pediatric patients that are have their rights, their welfare compromised in a way that's unacceptable as a result of research. So just wanted to make sure that people appreciate that. That's the balance. You know, we're struggling with that balance, but we need to remind people of that. So thank you.
Thank you, AJ. So unfortunately, I think we've run out of time for questions. The question that was posed about prospects of direct benefit, I think that could be its own webinar. So unfortunately, we kind of want to wrap up. Again, thank you, AJ. Really appreciate you talking with us today. And, you know, it's given me a lot to think about. You know, I think I've come at it from like, let's just get it done, and understanding all, I mean, slide after slide after slide of the challenges. And, you know, it can be daunting, you know, having been in this industry for 35 years. But I think that when we see patients like Ashley, we know we have to keep trying. We can't quit. We can't just think and throw our hands up. Thanks so much for being with us today. This concludes the part of our webinar. I do want to do a few housekeeping items in recognition. We would like to recognize and thank Gilead Science for their support with our educational webinars. We couldn't do it without them, so we want to thank them for participating and supporting us. We do want your feedback. When you log off today, you will have a short 4-question survey. It just really helps us get feedback, how we can continually improve. You make suggestions about topics, things you'd like to hear about. It's really kind of integral. I know that you get surveys about everything these days. I know it can be a lot. We've tried to make this as painless as possible. We have some upcoming webinars for 2023. We hope that you will join us. We're looking forward to talking about the delicate relationship between sponsors and sites, and really kind of continuing this conversation about how we can work together to expedite pediatric drug trials. And then we're also going to have a webinar about the culture of research. And this also helps expedite trials. If sites have this culture in their institution, and we'll have sites share with us about the struggles they've had to get there and how it's panned out for them. So we've posted a couple times in the chat how to access the webinar recording. This is the site network portal we referenced. Give us a day or two to get it posted there. If you need the link again, please feel free to reach out to the site network. And lastly, you do have the option to ask for CE credits for today's webinar. If you're a SOCR member or ACRP, these webinars are available for CE credits. And then if you have other institutions or other organizations where you'd like to apply for CE credit, we can provide you with the agenda and the information you might need to petition for that CE credit. So that wraps up today. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great day. Thanks.